He was a father with nothing left, no food, no hope, and no idea how to keep his daughter warm in the dead of winter. Then came a knock at the door, a paper bag, a purple knit hat, and everything changed. What began as a simple act of kindness from a stranger grew into a life rebuilt, one muffin, one moment, one miracle at a time. This is the true power of quiet love, of showing up, and of what happens when someone says, "I see you," and means it. You won't believe how far one small kindness can go. He was used to hiding things, worry, hunger, fear. But on that Tuesday morning in late January, Evan Carver couldn't hide the tremble in his hands as he zipped up his daughter's too-thin coat. The wind outside howled like it was angry at the world, and maybe it was. Maybe it was angry at men like him who couldn't even afford breakfast for the one person they loved more than anything. Maisie, just 6 years old, smiled up at him, her front teeth missing, her eyes wide and trusting in the way only a child's could be. She didn't ask about the growling in her stomach or why her lunchbox was lighter than usual. She didn't ask why they'd skipped dinner the night before or why the lights had flickered twice before going out. She just hugged his waist and whispered, "Love you, Daddy," before skipping off toward the bus stop. Evan watched her go, his breath catching in his throat. The worst part wasn't the hunger. It wasn't even the cold that seeped into his bones when he lay awake at night in their drafty apartment. It was the helplessness, the absolute soul-crushing realization that he couldn't give his daughter the kind of life she deserved. He'd worked once, steadily, proudly. Construction jobs that paid well when they were there. But the accident the year before had shattered more than his leg. It had taken away his mobility, his confidence, and eventually his job. The disability checks barely covered rent. Food stamps filled in some gaps, but never all. He'd sold the TV first, then his guitar, then the old wedding ring he still kept in the drawer, long after her absence had become permanent. And now they were out of everything, out of food, out of options. Evan sank into the worn kitchen chair, staring at the chipped linoleum floor. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. The empty cabinets mocked him. The refrigerator, humming dutifully, held only a bottle of mustard and a half-empty carton of milk, likely expired. The knock came at 9 a.m. sharp, a gentle rap against the door that startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone. He wasn't used to visitors. When he opened it, a woman stood there, bundled in a heavy coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She held a paper bag in her hands and offered a tentative smile. "Hi, I'm Harper," she said, "from down the hall. I hope this isn't weird, but I noticed your little girl hasn't had her hat the last few mornings." Evan blinked. Harper held up the bag. "I knit. Keeps my hands busy. There's a hat in here, and some muffins I made. Blueberry." She hesitated. "I always make too many." He should have said no. Pride told him to. Pride whispered that accepting handouts was a step too far, even now. But he thought of Maisie's pink ears yesterday, how she'd shivered but said nothing, just tugged her hood lower. He took the bag. "Thank you." Harper smiled again. It wasn't pitying, just warm. "If you ever need anything, I'm in 2B." He nodded, unsure what else to say. After she left, he opened the bag. The hat was soft, purple with little flecks of white. He pressed it to his face, breathing in the faint scent of lavender. The muffins were warm. He ate one, slowly, then wrapped the rest for Maisie. That night he told her a story about a princess in the snow who was saved by a purple crown made of wool. She giggled, her head tucked into the new hat. "It's magic," she said, eyes shining. "It's a hero hat." Evan tucked her in and turned off the light, retreating to the living room, where he sat in the dark, the remaining muffin untouched beside him. The next morning Harper knocked again, this time with soup. "I make too much," she said again. By the end of the week, she was knocking every day. Not always with food, sometimes just a smile or a scarf or a book for Maisie. Sometimes nothing but company, standing in his kitchen and talking softly while he washed the one plate they shared. Evan didn't know what to make of it. People didn't usually help him. People didn't usually see him. But Harper did. And slowly, day by day, the ice around his heart began to melt. He didn't ask for help, not really, not once. Not even when Harper offered more than food, rides to the clinic when his limp grew worse, help filling out forms he'd long stopped trying to understand. She did it quietly, without expectation. She never made him feel like he owed her anything, and maybe that's why it was so hard to stop her. Maisie adored her. From the moment Harper showed up at their door with that first purple hat, the little girl had claimed her as something special. "Miss Harper," she'd chirp each morning, sliding her hand into hers on the way down the hallway. "Miss Harper makes everything better." And somehow she did. Evan still remembered the day Harper asked about Maisie's mom. They'd been sitting on the steps outside the building, the late afternoon sun slanting across the concrete. Maisie was drawing chalk hearts on the sidewalk. "She left," Evan said simply. Harper didn't press, didn't ask when or why or if she was coming back. "She wasn't ready for this," he added after a moment, "for being a mom, for the hard parts." Harper looked over at Maisie, her curls bouncing as she laughed at her own crooked artwork. "Well," she said gently, "Maisie got the right parent then." He didn't say anything. He couldn't. His throat tightened too much for that. The next day Harper brought a crock pot of chili and a small envelope. "What's this?" Evan asked, frowning. She looked almost embarrassed. "Just a few gift cards I had lying around. Grocery store. Nothing big." He didn't take it. Not at first. But 2 days later, when Maisie came home from school with a note about the upcoming field trip, and Evan realized he couldn't afford even the $5 lunch fee, he quietly slipped the envelope from the drawer and used one of the cards to buy peanut butter, bread, and a bag of apples. The first apple Maisie bit into with a crunch. "This tastes like a happy sound," she declared, grinning. Evan had to turn away. Sometimes the shame came fast, like a punch to the gut. Other times it was quieter, a dull ache behind the ribs. But Harper never made him feel ashamed. That mattered. Then one morning she didn't knock. He waited. Maybe she was running late. Maybe she was sick. But by noon, worry bloomed in his chest. He sent Maisie to a neighbor's and knocked on Harper's door. No answer. The next day, still nothing. On the third day, he checked with the landlord. Harper, it turned out, had gone to take care of her mother out of state. "Emergency," the man said. Didn't say how long she'd be gone. The apartment felt colder after that, quieter. Maisie noticed, too. "I miss her soup," she whispered one night. Evan just nodded. They got by, barely. He'd scraped enough from the gift cards to stretch them a few weeks. He called a food pantry. Applied for every aid program Harper had once encouraged him to. He started walking to the library every afternoon when Maisie was at school, using the free internet to search for work-from-home jobs, gigs he could manage without standing too long. It wasn't much, but it was something. And then 6 weeks later, Harper came back. She knocked just like before. And Evan opened the door, heart thudding like a drum. Maisie shrieked and wrapped herself around Harper's legs. "I saved you a muffin," she said breathlessly. "I made it with Daddy." Harper's eyes brimmed, and she looked over Maisie's head to Evan. "You made muffins?" He shrugged. "We've been learning. I'm proud of you." 3 words, that was all, but it nearly undid him. That night, after Maisie went to bed, Harper stayed. They sat on the couch with their knees touching, not speaking much. And then, slowly, Evan reached for her hand. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't fireworks. It was something smaller, something steadier. It was hope. The days that followed Harper's return unfolded like the slow bloom of spring after a hard winter. Nothing happened all at once. There were no sudden windfalls, no magic solutions, no overnight rescues. But something had changed, not just in Evan's apartment or in the contents of his fridge, or even in his daughter's laughter, which had grown more frequent and less cautious. It had changed in him. He started to believe in mornings again. It wasn't easy. Evan still struggled with the pain in his leg on colder days, still found himself budgeting down to the last dollar, making meals stretch with tricks he'd learned in the leanest months, pasta water reused for soup, rice added to everything. But now there were days when he didn't feel like he was failing, days when he stood in the kitchen and looked over at Maisie, humming as she colored at the table and thought, "We're going to be okay." He owed that feeling to Harper, and maybe that's what scared him most. Because the last time he'd let someone that close, really close, they'd walked away and never looked back. They'd taken one look at the weight of his love and decided it was too much to carry. But Harper wasn't like that. She never made promises, but she always came back. Even when she'd been gone those weeks, she'd sent a postcard. A simple sketch of a sunflower on the front, the handwriting on the back unmistakably hers. "Tell Maisie I saw a hat just like hers today. I thought of her. And you. I'll be home soon. H." He'd tucked it into the mirror frame by the door, where he kept all the little things that reminded him to keep going. Maisie's school drawings, a receipt from the day they found shoes on sale, the corner of the envelope Harper had brought with those first gift cards. Every piece meant something. Every piece reminded him that he hadn't given up, that someone had seen him at his worst and stayed anyway. Harper started bringing over books instead of meals. Evan had never been much of a reader, but she read to Maisie in a way that made the words seem like magic spells. She even convinced Evan to join in once, handing him a novel with a dog-eared page and saying, "Start here. It's not about escaping. It's about remembering who you are." He didn't understand it at first, but then he read a line that stopped him cold, something about a man who had nothing, yet gave everything to the person he loved most. And suddenly Evan saw himself, not as a failure, not as a man limping through the days just trying to survive, but as a father who'd given his daughter safety even when the world tried to take it from them. One evening, as Harper brushed Maisie's hair and Evan stirred a pot of beans on the stove, Maisie looked up and said, "Can Miss Harper live with us?" Harper laughed, but Evan turned. Spoon paused mid-air. Maisie continued, as serious as she'd ever been. "She makes the house feel like it's full, even when it's quiet, like when Mama used to sing." Silence fell like a feather, light but impossible to ignore. Harper reached for Maisie's hand. "That's a beautiful thing to say, honey." Evan said nothing, but when their eyes met, there was something there he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Maybe he didn't have to do this alone anymore. On the first warm Saturday of March, Harper took them to the park. Maisie ran wild, her curls bouncing like springs, her arms stretched like wings. Evan watched her from the bench, Harper beside him, their shoulders brushing. "I didn't know if I'd ever get here," he said quietly. "Where?" "Here," laughing again, trusting someone. Harper turned to him. "You never had to get here alone." He looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, still shaking sometimes when the stress got too loud. "I didn't know how to ask." "You didn't have to," she said. "You just opened the door." A moment passed, then another. He reached over and held her hand again. She didn't let go. Spring brought more than green shoots pushing through cracks in the sidewalk. It brought letters from programs Evan had almost forgotten he applied to. One offered him a part-time remote position entering invoices for a construction supply company, low pay, but flexible hours. Another scheduled him for a phone interview for a customer service job with a disability support firm. And most unexpectedly, the public library, where Harper had introduced him to the staff during one of their visits, called to say they were opening a new community outreach assistant role and thought he might be a good fit. He stared at the phone after that call, blinking back disbelief. He hadn't thought of himself as employable in a long time. That night, he told Harper over leftover lentil stew, "You're not just employable," she said. "You're essential." He laughed, shaking his head. "You always say things like that, like I'm not just barely scraping by. Because you're not, she replied. You've been surviving a storm with nothing but duct tape and stubbornness. That's not scraping by. That's strength. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just looked at her, really looked, and realized that somewhere along the way, her kindness had become part of the rhythm of their lives. She was the heartbeat that had brought life back into their apartment, into him. He got the library job, 2 days a week to start, helping with donation drives, setting up weekend reading events, organizing boxes of free books for the shelter. He came home that first afternoon with ink smudges on his hands and a paper cut on his thumb, and he couldn't stop smiling. Maisie hugged him like he'd brought home treasure. "You smell like books," she whispered against his shirt. He laughed, holding her tighter. Best smell in the world. By June, things were better. Not perfect, but better. There were still nights when he counted pennies. Still days when his leg throbbed so badly he had to sit down halfway through walking Maisie to school. But the cabinets weren't empty anymore. The electricity stayed on. And every Sunday, Harper came over with a new recipe and a smile that said, "We made it through another week." They celebrated Maisie's 7th birthday with homemade cupcakes and 3 balloons Harper had tied to her chair. It wasn't much, but to Maisie it was everything. "This is my best birthday ever," she declared between bites of vanilla frosting. "Even better than the one with the zoo trip, because Daddy didn't cry this time." Evan turned away, blinking fast. Harper reached across the table and touched his hand. Her fingers were warm, steady. That night, after Maisie was asleep and the kitchen was clean, Harper stayed a little longer. They sat on the fire escape, watching the city hum and blink in the distance. "I was thinking," Harper said, her voice soft, "about maybe looking for a bigger place." Evan's heart jumped. "Oh? I mean, this building is fine," she said quickly, "but you and Maisie could use more space, and I could—" She hesitated. "Maybe we could look together?" He stared at her. The word filled the space between them like light. Together. It had been a long time since he'd thought of his life as something he might share with someone else. Not just moments, but plans. He didn't answer right away, just leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't their first kiss, but it was the first time it felt like a promise. They found a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms, a creaky porch, a yard with grass that grew too fast. But to Evan, it felt like a castle. They moved in late summer. Maisie claimed the attic room, Harper painted the kitchen pale yellow, and Evan fixed the broken railing with parts he scavenged from the hardware store's clearance bin. It wasn't easy. The bills were tighter. Harper still worked at the community center, and Evan split time between the library and the invoice job. But they had coffee every morning, pancakes on Saturdays, and laughter in the walls. One night, Maisie came downstairs in her pajamas holding a wrinkled paper. "I have to write about my hero," she said. "For school?" Harper and Evan exchanged a smile. Maisie held up the paper. "I picked Daddy and Miss Harper. I said Miss Harper saved Daddy, and Daddy saved me." Evan's throat closed up. Harper hugged Maisie tightly, brushing a kiss against her forehead. After she went to bed, Evan stood in the kitchen for a long time, holding that paper in his hands. It wasn't printed, it wasn't fancy, but it was worth more than anything he'd ever owned. He folded it carefully and placed it next to the old postcard, the purple hat, and the letter Harper had once written on a paper napkin when she thought he wasn't looking. "You don't have to be whole to be worthy of love." In the fall, Harper proposed. It wasn't with a ring. It wasn't even a question. Just one evening, in the quiet of the living room, while they folded laundry, she said, "Let's stop pretending this isn't forever." Evan kissed her knuckles. "Okay." And just like that, they became a family, not by blood, but by choice. And it all started with a muffin. Winter came again, but this time it didn't feel so cold. The little house creaked in the wind, but it was filled with warmth from the inside out. the kind that came from the smell of soup on the stoves, laughter echoing down the hallway, and a child's feet running through the kitchen wearing mismatched socks. Evan stood at the window one evening, watching the snow fall in slow, heavy flakes. Harper was reading with Maisie in the other room, their voices soft and overlapping, and he could hear the familiar rhythm of a storybook they'd read at least 20 times. He smiled. There were still hard days, the kind that brought unexpected bills, old fears, or a limp worse than usual. But now there was always someone to hold him through them, to remind him that the man who once sat in a silent apartment with an empty fridge and a shaking heart was still here, but stronger. Not because everything got easier, but because he kept going, because someone saw him, really saw him, and stayed. Maisie had grown taller, her legs longer, her questions sharper. She liked to stand on the kitchen chair now when she stirred batter, claiming it made her feel chef important. Evan would lean on the counter and watch her like he used to watch his world slip through his fingers. Only now he watched it return. One night after dinner, Maisie padded into the living room in her pajamas, cradling a sheet of paper. "Miss Harper, Daddy, look what I made." She handed it over with the seriousness of a lawyer presenting evidence. On the page, drawn in crayons, were 3 stick figures, one tall with a lopsided hat, one medium with dark curls, one small with huge eyes and what looked like an apron. Above them, in careful bubble letters, were the words, "My family is my favorite story." Evan swallowed the lump in his throat as Harper held the paper with both hands, her fingers trembling. "Did you make this today?" Maisie nodded. "We had to draw the thing we're most thankful for." Evan pulled her onto his lap. "I'm thankful for you." "I'm thankful for pancakes," she whispered with a grin, then leaned close. "And for the day Miss Harper knocked on our door. That's the day everything changed." Harper looked at Evan, her eyes glassy with quiet tears. He nodded. Later, after Maisie had gone to bed, Harper curled up beside him on the couch. "Do you think," she asked quietly, "that if I hadn't come down that hallway that day, you would have made it through?" He didn't answer at first, just reached for her hand, pressing it to his chest. "I would have survived," he said, "but I wouldn't have lived. There's a difference." She kissed his shoulder. "And you?" he asked. "I didn't know what I was missing until I met you two," she said. "You showed me what it meant to show up and stay. You changed me, too." They sat in silence, the kind of silence that feels more like a blanket than an absence. From the hallway, the purple knit hat still hung on a hook. Maisie insisted it stay there, her lucky crown, she called it. Evan had offered to put it in a keepsake box once, but she'd shaken her head. "It has to stay by the door," she said, "so we never forget where we started." Sometimes, when Evan was alone in the house, he would walk past it and run his fingers over the stitches. Each loop and line held a memory, the tremble in his hands that morning, the ache of hunger, the knock at the door that had sounded like salvation. A simple kindness, a warm hat, a paper bag with too many muffins. Harper's voice in the hallway. "I always make too much." It wasn't charity, it wasn't pity, it was love, wrapped in the smallest of gestures. That spring, the library hosted a community dinner in the park. Evan helped plan it. Harper baked half the desserts. Maisie ran around with a name tag she made herself that read, "My daddy can do anything." They ate under string lights and laughed with strangers who didn't feel like strangers anymore. Near the end of the night, Evan stood at the edge of the field, watching Maisie chase a firefly. Harper came up beside him, linking her arm with his. "You did this," she whispered. "You brought her here. You brought us here." He shook his head. "No, you saw us, you fed us, you stayed." "We did it," she said. "Together." Maisie squealed in the distance, clutching a glowing jar. "It's magic!" she yelled. "It really is." Evan looked at Harper, her face lit by the soft golden glow of the park lights. The breeze lifted her hair slightly, and, for a moment, he saw every version of her, the the woman with the paper bag of muffins, the voice at the door, the constant, unwavering presence that changed everything. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that the worst thing in the world was having nothing left to give. But you showed me, sometimes giving what little you have is the beginning of everything." Harper leaned into him. "And sometimes," she whispered, "loving someone means feeding them when they can't feed themselves." He looked down at her. "You fed my daughter when I couldn't," he said. "And because of that, you fed me too. You changed both our lives." As the stars blinked to life overhead, Evan closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't hungry anymore. Not for food, not for hope, not for love, because it had found them, quietly, gently, on a Tuesday morning, with a paper bag, a purple hat, and a knock that saved a life. And that was enough. Maisie liked routines. She liked knowing that pancakes came on Saturdays, that bedtime stories would be read in funny voices, and that Miss Harper would hum while she cooked. It gave her comfort in a world that had once felt like it could shift without warning, like when her mom left with a suitcase and never came back. She didn't talk about that, not really. Just asked sometimes, "Do you think she misses me?" with a look too old for her face. Evan didn't always know how to answer, but Harper did. "I think sometimes people love us the best they can," she would say, "and sometimes it just isn't enough. But that doesn't mean it's your fault, or that you aren't lovable." Maisie would nod and crawl into her lap. Harper never pulled away. By the time the school year rolled around again, Evan was walking straighter. Not without pain, his legs still gave him grief on cold mornings, but with purpose, with pride. The library kept giving him more hours, and he started helping with youth literacy programs on the weekends. He found he had a knack for reaching kids who didn't want to read, kids who, like him, had grown up thinking books were for other people. Maisie had started 3rd grade. She came home every day with stories about her teacher, about the boy who traded her a granola bar for her carrot sticks, about how she was going to write a poem for the school contest. "I want to write about us," she told Evan one night, "about how we used to be kind of sad, but now we're not." He smiled. "That's a pretty good story." "It has to rhyme, though," she added seriously. "It's the rules." That weekend, Evan sat with her at the kitchen table while she worked out the verses. Harper passed by occasionally, refilling mugs, offering a rhyme or two, tousling Maisie's curls. And when the poem was done, Maisie stood on the chair and read it aloud, her voice proud and clear. "I used to be small and scared and blue. But then my dad and Harper, too, they built a house from hope and glue. And now our hearts feel big and true." She looked up, cheeks flushed. "Do you think it's good enough?" Evan reached over, squeezing her hand. "It's perfect." Harper kissed the top of her head. "It's more than good enough, baby. It's honest." Maisie beamed. When she won 3rd place, she asked if she could bring her medal to the library to show the books. Evan laughed. "I think the books will be proud." Things weren't easy every day. There were times Harper's work hours were cut, times when Evan had to call 3 different clinics to find one that accepted his insurance, times when he'd stare at the last $20 in their account and debate whether it went to groceries or gas. But they always figured it out. Harper started keeping a little jar on the windowsill tucked behind the herbs. Into it went every extra coin, every spare bill they could scrounge. "For when we need magic," she'd say. Maisie called it the hope jar. One afternoon in October, they opened it. Maisie had been invited to a classmate's birthday party, her first real one since the move, and all she wanted was to bring a gift that wouldn't look sad or small. They counted the coins together, stacking quarters and lining up wrinkled singles. It wasn't much, but enough for a brand-new sketch pad and a set of markers in bright, cheerful colors. Maisie wrapped it herself in old newspaper, drawing hearts on the front. At the party, she gave it with both hands. The birthday girl, a shy girl named Naomi, opened it and gasped. "I love drawing," Naomi said. "This is the best." Maisie smiled so hard her cheeks dimpled. Later that night, as Evan tucked her in, she whispered, "Daddy, it felt really good to give someone something. I get it now." He kissed her forehead. "Get what?" "You and Harper. Why you help people." He nodded slowly. "Yeah?" She yawned. "It's like your heart gets warmer, like soup in winter." Harper poked her head in. "What's this about soup?" Maisie giggled under the covers. "You're the soup lady." "I'll take it," Harper replied with a wink, and Evan thought about that phrase long after she left the room. Soup in winter. Maybe that was what they'd become. To each other, to themselves. Something warm when the world turned cold. Thanksgiving came quietly that year. They didn't have a big table or a roast turkey with all the trimmings. What they had was a roast chicken, Harper's famous stuffing, and mashed potatoes made with more butter than Evan thought strictly necessary, but he didn't complain. Maisie had made little place cards for each of them, folding scrap paper and writing their names in colored marker, complete with doodles of smiling pumpkins. She wore a dress they'd found at the thrift store for $5, the hem just brushing her shins, and she'd insisted on brushing her own hair for the fancy holiday. She was radiant, not because of the dress or the bows, but because she glowed in a way that children only do when they feel safe, seen, loved. They went around the table saying what they were thankful for. When it came to Maisie, she stood on her chair and declared, "I'm thankful for chicken, and for my new room, and for Miss Harper who knows all the stories, and for Daddy because he's my forever hero." Harper blinked fast. Evan didn't even try to hide his tears. After dinner, while Harper and Maisie played a board game on the living room floor, Evan stepped outside to take out the trash. The air was sharp and clear. A neighbor across the street strung up early Christmas lights, humming along with a song Evan couldn't quite make out. He paused before heading back inside, looking up at the house. The light in the window glowed golden. He could hear Harper's laughter, Maisie's delighted squeal. Somewhere deep in his chest, something unlocked. He'd almost forgotten what home could feel like. It wasn't a roof or a front door or a lease. It was warmth. It was knowing someone would wait up for you. It was falling asleep with a child breathing steadily down the hall and waking up to the smell of coffee you didn't make yourself. It was quiet love, daily, ordinary, persistent love. That night, Harper fell asleep on the couch, curled into the throw blanket, her face soft in the dim light from the kitchen. Evan didn't wake her. He just sat beside her for a long time, holding her hand, marveling at how many things could grow from a single act of kindness. A few weeks later, the first snow fell. Maisie squealed at the window. "It's sticking," she cried, her breath fogging up the glass. "Can we go outside, please, please, please?" Evan pulled on his old coat and helped her into hers. They trudged into the backyard, bundled like marshmallows, and started making snow angels. Harper joined them with steaming mugs of cocoa, laughing when Maisie pelted her with a snowball. They stayed out until their cheeks were numb and their fingers stiff, then huddled under blankets on the couch while Maisie slurped cocoa through a candy cane and told stories about snow princesses and sledding dragons. Later, when Maisie had fallen asleep, Harper turned to Evan. "You know she's different now, right?" He looked at her. "She doesn't flinch when the lights flicker," she said. "She doesn't scan the fridge like she's checking what's left. She's just a kid. She trusts the ground under her feet." Evan nodded. "I notice it too." "You did that," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, we did." Harper leaned her head against his shoulder. "When I knocked on your door, I wasn't trying to change your life. I saw a kid without a hat." He let out a breath. "And I saw someone who didn't treat us like charity." She looked up at him. "You loved us like we were already yours." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that felt soft, like snow landing on rooftops. Then Evan whispered, "Marry me." Harper's breath caught. He wasn't holding a ring. There was no speech, just a question, bare and real. Her answer came without hesitation. Yes. Not because he'd asked at the perfect moment, not because he'd knelt or promised anything grand, but because the man who once couldn't feed his daughter had found a way to build a life again, and invited her to stay. They married quietly. No big celebration, just a small courthouse ceremony on a windy March morning, Maisie in a flowered dress and Evan in a borrowed suit jacket that was a little too short in the sleeves. Harper wore a simple blue scarf and carried a bouquet Maisie had made from paper and ribbon. They said their vows in front of a judge who looked like he'd seen 1,000 quick weddings and knew better than to ask for long speeches. Evan simply looked at Harper and said, "You found us when we had nothing. I'll spend the rest of my life giving you everything I have." That was enough. They celebrated with milkshakes and fries at the diner down the street. Maisie dipped her fries in chocolate sauce and declared it the best day ever. Evan couldn't stop smiling. For once, nothing was missing. They had each other. And somehow, that made them whole. The spring after the wedding was wet and green and hopeful. Maisie planted tulip bulbs with Harper in the narrow patch of soil along the front walkway, even though Harper warned her they probably wouldn't bloom until the next season. "Sometimes," she said, wiping her muddy hands on her jeans, "we plant things now that we won't see grow for a while. Doesn't mean they won't." Evan watched them from the porch, sipping black coffee from the chipped mug he always used. The scene looked like something out of someone else's life. A life he used to think was too far away to ever touch. But now he was living it, one sunrise, one school lunch packed, one bedtime kiss at a time. Harper worked days at the community center, helping organize free meal drives and job training for single parents. She often came home with flyers, ideas, new plans. Evan teased her that she was always trying to save the world. She teased him back that she was just trying to repay a little of the good that had found her. Evan's library hours had increased too. The head librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth, had taken a liking to him after watching him comfort a nervous boy during story time. "You've got a calmness," she said, "the kind that makes people stay." He started leading a monthly Dad and Me story hour, which sometimes only had 3 or 4 attendees, but they came back every time. A few fathers even started lingering afterward, asking quiet questions about how to navigate custody battles or stretch a paycheck. Evan didn't always have answers, but he had been there. He knew what it meant to feel like you were failing, even while giving everything you had. He told them what Harper had told him. "You're not broken. You're tired. There's a difference." And when one of the dads started showing up early just to talk, Evan made room for him, just like Harper had made room for him. Summer brought new rhythms. Maisie spent her days at the local day camp, earning her first friendship bracelet, her first scraped knee of the season, and a deep tan on her arms and nose. She told Evan all about archery, even though she hadn't hit the target once, and brought home pine cones painted with glitter and pride. One afternoon she came bursting through the door, waving a crumpled letter in the air. "Guess what?" she shouted, cheeks flushed. "I got invited to spend a weekend at Lily's cabin with her family." Evan blinked. "Lily from school?" Maisie nodded vigorously. "We'll hike and sleep in bunk beds, and they have a fire pit for s'mores." He looked at the letter, noting the dates, the permission slip, the cheerful handwriting from Lily's mom, the words blurred slightly at the edges. He wasn't ready to let her go, not even for 2 nights. But he saw the way her eyes sparkled and how her backpack was already halfway packed. "Okay," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's get you ready." Harper wrapped an arm around his waist later as he stood in the kitchen, staring at Maisie's toothbrush lying beside her suitcase. "She's growing up," Harper said softly. "I know," he said. I remember when she used to cry if I left the room." "Now she runs toward life," Harper murmured, Because you taught her how. Evan nodded, though a lump caught in his throat. He hadn't realized that letting go could be a form of love, too. The weekend without Maisie was quieter than Evan expected. The house felt bigger, the meals simpler. He and Harper went for walks, drank coffee on the porch, talked without interruption. And on Saturday night, Harper turned toward him as they sat in bed and asked, "Have you ever thought about more?" He looked up. "More?" She hesitated. "Another child, maybe not now, but someday." He blinked, unsure how to respond. He hadn't let himself consider that. For so long, survival had been the only goal. Now they had peace, joy even. The thought of adding to that felt both terrifying and sacred. "I'd want that," he said slowly, "with you." She smiled, reaching for his hand. Just a thought, but a nice one. Evan stared up at the ceiling long after she fell asleep, imagining a second heartbeat in their home, a baby wrapped in blankets, Maisie reading books to a sibling, proud and patient. The future no longer looked like a storm to be outrun. It looked like something they could build. When Maisie returned Sunday afternoon, sunburned and glowing, she hugged Evan so tightly he had to laugh. "I missed you," she whispered. "I missed you more," he said into her hair. She pulled back, grinning. "Did you cry?" "Only a little." Harper winked from behind her. Maisie ran to her room, digging through her suitcase. She returned with a small pine branch tied with a blue ribbon. "For you, Daddy. It smells like outside." Evan took it gently, his throat tight. "Thank you, baby." "I told Lily's mom you make the best pancakes," she added matter-of-factly. "So they said I can invite you next time." Evan nodded, eyes damp. "I'd like that." Harper watched him from the hallway, arms crossed over her chest, a quiet smile on her lips. "You're a good dad," she said later, when Maisie was brushing her teeth. Evan looked down. "I try." "You do more than try. You show up, every day, even when it's hard." He reached for her hand. "I had to. She needed me." "And now she has both of us," Harper said. They stood together in the hallway as the bathroom light glowed softly behind Maisie, the sound of her singing echoing off tile. The melody was off-key and joyful. "I like our life," Harper whispered. "Me too," Evan said. And for the first time in his life, he believed it fully, with no shadow in the corners. That August, the town held its annual community fair, a small tradition filled with pie contests, music from local bands, and kids running between booths with cotton candy and popsicles in hand. Evan hadn't gone the previous year. Back then, crowds had made him anxious. The idea of smiling for strangers when he could barely keep the lights on felt like pretending to be someone else. But this year, when Maisie begged him to go, he said yes without hesitation. Harper wore her favorite summer dress, yellow with little white flowers, and braided Maisie's hair into 2 neat plaits before they left. Evan packed a cooler with water bottles and a few sandwiches, just in case. They weren't poor anymore, not the way they'd once been, but habits from hunger days didn't disappear easily. You always packed food. You always planned ahead, just in case. The fair was held in the field behind the high school, tents and booths dotting the grass like bright mushrooms. There were games, ring tosses and fishing lines with paper prizes, and a bake sale Harper immediately gravitated to, inspecting the lemon bars like a jeweler analyzing diamonds. Evan and Maisie wandered toward the makeshift stage where a trio of teenagers were tuning guitars. The lead singer had a voice like gravel and sunlight. Maisie clapped along, dancing in circles, her bare feet dirty with dust and joy. A few people recognized Evan from the library. One woman tapped his shoulder and said, "You helped my son find his first book last week. He hasn't stopped reading since. Thank you." Evan had never been good at accepting praise, but he nodded, murmured something about just doing his job, and watched her walk away feeling oddly full. Later, Harper handed him a paper plate with a single slice of blueberry pie and a wooden fork. "Taste this," she said. "It's criminally good." He took a bite, the crust flaked perfectly, the filling warm and tart. That's not just pie, he said. That's a life experience. She laughed, brushing crumbs from his chin. See what you almost missed by staying home? Maisie sat between them on a blanket, humming as she peeled the label from a lemonade bottle. This is the best day ever, she said for the third time that summer. And Evan believed her. That night Harper tucked Maisie in while Evan washed dishes. When she came out, she held something behind her back. What's that? He asked. She pulled it forward, a little notebook, bound with ribbon. It's from Maisie. She gave it to me earlier, but wanted me to wait. The first page had 3 stick figures again, but this time they were holding hands, standing in front of what looked like their house. Above them, in careful, deliberate letters, were the words, "You are the reason we're okay now." Evan read the words twice. Did she mean you or me? He asked. Harper leaned into his side. Both of us. I think that's the point. They put the notebook on the mantel, right next to the framed photo from their wedding day, the one where Maisie stood between them holding both their hands, smiling with all her missing teeth. September brought cooler nights and earlier sunsets. Maisie started 4th grade, her backpack now covered in pins and doodles she'd drawn with permanent marker. Evan walked her to the bus stop every morning, waving until the yellow doors closed, then standing for a moment longer than necessary before turning back toward the house. The quiet no longer felt like absence. It felt like breath. One day, while Harper was at work and Evan was organizing a donation drive at the library, a man stopped by with a donation bag. He was tall, early 40s, clean-cut, but clearly tired. His eyes were cautious, but kind. "Hey," he said, glancing at Evan's name tag, "you run the story hour here, right? My ex says it's helped our daughter come out of her shell." Evan smiled. "That's good to hear." The man shifted. "I also heard you've been through some rough times. Single parent, right?" "I was," Evan said. The man swallowed. I'm there now. I lost my job a few months ago. My daughter's 5. I don't really know what I'm doing. I saw a flyer that said, 'You guys have free lunches some weekends?'" Evan stepped out from behind the desk. "We do. And we have kids' books, job help, school supply drives, whatever we can manage." The man nodded, eyes glossy. "I'm not used to asking for help." "I wasn't either," Evan said. "But someone helped me when I needed it. No questions asked. That changed everything." The man stared at him. "Why?" "Because I had a daughter," Evan said simply, "and someone saw that she deserved more, that I deserved another chance to give it to her." They sat for a while after that, not saying much. Sometimes that was enough. Being seen, being heard. When the man left, Evan added 2 extra sandwiches to the lunch bag and tucked in an apple, just like Harper used to do. That winter, the snow came earlier than expected. They strung lights along the porch and made hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. Harper baked cookies almost every weekend, experimenting with new spices and icing techniques, while Maisie ran quality control. One night, Evan sat at the kitchen table watching Harper roll dough, her sleeves pushed up, flour on her cheek. He thought about that first morning she'd knocked on his door with a paper bag and a purple hat. She caught him staring. "What?" she said. He stood, walked over, brushed the flour away with his thumb. "You saved me," he said quietly. She set the rolling pin down. "No," she whispered. "We saved each other." "No," she whispered. "We saved each other." Evan didn't answer. He just leaned forward and kissed her gently, his hand still resting on her flour-dusted cheek. Maisie ran in moments later, slipping slightly on the hardwood in her socks, waving a construction paper snowflake she had spent the last hour carefully snipping into something intricate and lopsided and entirely beautiful. She held it up with both hands like a trophy and said, "I made it for the window so the real snow knows it's welcome." Harper crouched down and helped her tape it up. Evan just watched them both, his chest tight with something too big for words. This was his family. This was what he'd once thought he might never have again. The following week, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed to Mr. Carver from the city's Family Resources Department. He opened it cautiously, expecting paperwork or maybe something bureaucratic and cold. But it was a nomination letter. One of the parents from the library had written in his name for a new community service award. He stared at it in disbelief. The words were ordinary, but the weight of them felt enormous, a recognition of something he hadn't even realized people had noticed. They were holding a banquet in February. Evan didn't know if he'd go. Later that evening, he showed Harper the letter. She read it twice, then looked up at him with that steady warmth she always carried. "Why are you hesitating?" she asked. "Because I don't do what I do to be thanked," he said. "I do it because someone once showed up for me. I'm just passing it on." "And that's exactly why you should go," she said. "Because the world needs to see what real change looks like. It looks like a man who didn't give up." Maisie found his old button-down shirt and insisted they iron it together. She made him a paper tie decorated with stars and hearts and clipped it to his collar with a clothespin. "You're going to be the fanciest hero ever," she said. At the banquet, Evan sat quietly in the second row, not expecting anything. When they called his name, he almost didn't stand. But Harper nudged him, and Maisie clapped so loudly her hands turned pink. He walked to the front, face flushed, heart thudding in his chest. When the mayor handed him the plaque, she said, "Sometimes the people who change a community the most aren't the ones shouting from stages. They're the ones who make sure no one goes hungry, who show up quietly and consistently, who teach us what resilience really means." Evan said nothing, just nodded, and as he turned, he caught Harper's eyes and Maisie's wide grin. That was enough. They celebrated with burgers and milkshakes at the same diner where he and Harper had shared their first unofficial date. Maisie brought the plaque in with her, setting it carefully on the table like a sacred object. The waitress asked what it was for, and Maisie said proudly, "My dad saved our whole family." The woman smiled, said, "Sounds like a good man." Evan had to look down at his plate to hide how much that meant. In early March, Harper came home with a look on her face that made Evan's stomach drop. Not fear, not sadness, just a quiet kind of awe. She handed him a small white stick with a pink line across it. He stared at it, blinked, then looked back at her. "Are we?" he asked. She nodded. "We are." Maisie squealed when they told her, jumping up and down in her socks, then immediately began drawing up a list of names for her new sibling. Half of them were from cartoons, but Evan didn't care. The very fact that she felt secure enough to imagine a future with someone else in it meant everything. Pregnancy wasn't easy for Harper. Some days she was tired, nauseous, frustrated. Evan took over more of the housework, tried new recipes, kept ginger ale stocked in the fridge. Maisie wrote notes on sticky paper and left them on Harper's pillow. "You are strong. You are magic. The baby loves you already." Evan kept every one of them, tucking them into a shoebox he labeled, "For when they're older." Because one day that child would ask what life was like before they arrived, and Evan wanted to be able to show them. They found out it was a boy. Maisie announced she was going to teach him everything, even the proper way to peel an orange, and which picture books had the best endings. She started placing her favorite toys in a box labeled, "To share with baby." In July, Harper went into labor just after sunrise. Evan held her hand the entire way to the hospital, whispering whatever he could think of, though most of it came out in jumbled prayers and half-formed sentences. Maisie stayed with a neighbor, hugging them both so tight at the door, Evan thought his heart might split open. The birth was long, difficult. But when the nurse finally placed the baby boy into Harper's arms, everything else fell away. Evan stared down at his son, small and pink and furious at the bright lights, and felt something inside him settle, like he'd been holding his breath for years without knowing it. They named him Jonah. Evan didn't know why the name felt right, only that it did. When they brought him home, Maisie held him like he was made of glass, whispering, "I promise to always be your best friend." Then she looked up at Evan and said, "Daddy, you can rest now. We're safe." Evan didn't answer. He couldn't. He just pulled her close, his son nestled against his chest, Harper beside them, and let himself cry for everything he'd almost lost, for the hungry nights, the silence, the fear, and for the days ahead full of pancakes and morning light and crayons scattered across the kitchen table. The years passed quietly, not without struggle, but with meaning. Jonah grew into a wild-hearted boy who loved books almost as much as he loved mud. Maisie became the kind of teenager who stood up for others, who baked cookies for new kids at school, who told her friends, "My parents weren't always okay, but they always showed up." Evan and Harper aged gently. He kept working at the library until his leg finally forced him to retire. Harper opened a nonprofit that provided parenting support to families in need. They never forgot where they came from, never stopped remembering what a paper bag of muffins and a purple knit hat had started. And every year, on the same morning in January, Evan would wake early, pour 2 cups of coffee, and sit at the kitchen table with Harper. They would watch the snow fall and say nothing for a while. Then Harper would smile and whisper, "Remember?" And Evan would nod, eyes misty. "I remember." One morning when Jonah was 12 and Maisie was in college and the house felt quieter again, Harper found a photo tucked inside an old book on the shelf. It was the 3 of them, before Jonah, sitting on the couch laughing over something that had probably long been forgotten. She brought it to Evan and said, "This was the moment I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were never just surviving. You were building." Evan smiled. "You fed our daughter when I couldn't," he said. "You changed both our lives." Harper kissed his cheek. "You fed me too, Evan." And that made all the difference. And it had. Every quiet act, every small kindness, every night he held on, and every morning she stayed, it all mattered. And it always would. Harper kissed his cheek. "You fed me too, Evan." And that made all the difference. Maisie came home from college that fall with new freckles, second-hand philosophy books, and a habit of hugging longer than she used to. She'd chosen a small liberal arts school a few hours away, majoring in early education. When Evan had asked her why, she said, "Because the way you read to me changed how I saw the world. I want to do that for someone else." Jonah was 10 now, sharp-tongued and wide-eyed, with a penchant for asking impossible questions at bedtime. "If you could only keep one memory, what would it be?" he asked one night, curled under his Star Wars blanket. Evan thought for a long moment, then said, "The day you were born, because it gave me more to live for than just surviving." Jonah nodded solemnly and fell asleep within minutes. The library had become more than a job for Evan. After retiring officially, he stayed on as a volunteer, helping with literacy nights, mentoring teens with rough starts, even starting a weekend writing group that grew from 3 people to 12 in a matter of months. One of the young men in the group, Mateo, had been couch-hopping since he was 16. Evan never pried, but he made sure there was always hot coffee, snacks, and a ride home if needed. Eventually, Mateo asked if he could bring his younger brother sometime. "Of course," Evan said. "That's what we're here for." Harper's nonprofit had taken root in the community. She ran parenting classes and food drives, partnered with shelters, and helped launch a winter coat exchange. People came to her not because she wore suits or held degrees, but because she listened. She knew what it meant to have nothing, and never made anyone feel small for needing something. That winter, Evan found a box in the attic while searching for Christmas decorations. Inside were the old drawings Maisie had made as a child, hearts, stars, their little stick-figure family with smiles stretched too wide. At the bottom was the purple knit hat, slightly stretched, still soft. He held it for a long time. That simple thing had started everything. He brought it down and set it by the fireplace. Harper saw it and smiled. "I remember the day I gave that to her. "I remember you," Evan said. "The way you stood there like it was no big deal." But it was. It saved us. On Christmas morning, Maisie placed the hat in a shadow box with the words, "Where it all began," stenciled underneath. It hung in their hallway from then on, just above a photo of their wedding and beside a print Jonah had made at school of a tree with everyone's fingerprints for leaves. Evan's leg still ached sometimes. The cold settled into it like it was staking claim. But he moved more easily now, not because the pain had left, but because love had filled the places that once carried only fear. The boy who used to sit on the edge of his bed wondering how to feed his daughter had become a man who had fed many, not just with food, but with presence. In March, Maisie came home for spring break and found Harper in the kitchen, laughing over a failed attempt at gluten-free cookies. "They taste like regret," Harper said, spitting one into the trash. Maisie snorted and said, "That should be a cookbook title." Evan came in just then, carrying groceries. He kissed Harper's forehead and asked if they needed backup dessert. "There's a pie in the freezer," Harper said. Evan grinned. "Always a plan B." Later that night, the three of them sat on the porch while Jonah practiced basketball in the driveway. The air smelled of thawing earth and someone barbecuing a few houses down. Maisie leaned her head on Evan's shoulder. "You know what I was thinking about today?" "What's that?" "That if you hadn't opened the door that morning for Harper, I don't know where we'd be." He looked down at her. "You don't have to know where we would have been. We're here now," she smiled. "That's true, but I still think about it, about the moments that matter, the ones that quietly change everything." Jonah bounced the ball over and flopped down at Harper's feet. "I think when I grow up, I want to be like Dad," he said suddenly. "Like not the old version, the one from the stories when things were hard. I mean now, who helps people even when they don't ask?" Evan looked at Harper. Her eyes were glassy. She nodded once. That night, as he locked up and turned out the porch light, Evan felt something deep in his chest. A fullness, not pride, not even relief, just peace. He no longer worried about being enough, because he'd become the kind of man his children admired, the kind of partner Harper trusted, the kind of friend others turned to, because once upon a time someone had knocked on his door, not with judgment, not with questions, just with warmth. And because of that, everything had changed. He set the purple hat gently on the shelf near the front door, a reminder always of how far they'd come, and of how love, quiet, consistent, and freely given, had fed them all. Jonah's 11th birthday arrived on a rainy Thursday in April. The skies had opened before dawn and never stopped, turning the streets into shallow rivers and the backyard into a spongy mess of mud and drowned dandelions. The party they'd planned, a scavenger hunt and picnic at the park, was rescheduled. Evan expected disappointment, sulking maybe, the kind of quiet pouting that kids tried to hide but never quite could. But Jonah didn't complain. Instead, he built a blanket fort in the living room big enough for all four of them, decorated it with paper stars, and passed out invitations written in crayon. He called it the Castle of Backup Plans. Maisie helped hang a string of lights inside, while Harper baked chocolate cupcakes that sank slightly in the middle, but still smelled like heaven. They all crawled inside together, sitting cross-legged around a plastic tray of juice boxes and popcorn, and played board games for hours. They laughed until their sides ached, until Evan had to wipe his glasses and Harper's eyeliner smudged from tears. That night, when Jonah was tucked into bed and the dishes were drying in the rack, Harper leaned against the doorframe and looked at Evan. "You ever think about how different it could have been?" "Every day," he said. She crossed the room slowly, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his chest. "We were all falling apart, weren't we?" she whispered. "In our own ways. And somehow we found each other," he said, "and we held on." He thought about the past then, not as a wound, but as a road. A hard, cracked, twisting road that had led them here. Every sleepless night, every empty fridge, every late bill, every knock at the door that hadn't come, until the one that did. He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for knocking," he said. "Thank you for answering," she replied. Summer came early that year. By May, the air was thick with heat and the smell of fresh-cut grass. Harper's nonprofit was hosting a community cookout in the park, and Evan volunteered to grill, standing behind 2 donated barbecues with a spatula in one hand and a water bottle in the other, sweat running down the back of his neck. Maisie handed out lemonade and free books to kids. Jonah organized a pickup soccer game in the field, yelling instructions with the confidence of someone twice his age. Halfway through the event, a man Evan recognized from the library approached. His name was Malcolm. He'd been coming in every Thursday for nearly a year now, usually quiet, always reading job listings or printing resumes. He'd never said much, but he always nodded at Evan when he walked by. That afternoon, Malcolm stood in front of the grill, hands in his pockets. "You remember the first thing you said to me?" he asked. Evan frowned, thinking back. "No, I don't." "You said, 'Hey, if you ever want coffee that doesn't taste like printer ink, I know a spot.' And then you handed me a coupon to the diner." Evan laughed. "That sounds like me." Malcolm nodded. "That was the first time anyone talked to me like I wasn't a screw-up." "You weren't," Evan said. "You were tired. There's a difference." Malcolm looked down at his shoes. "I got a job last week. Warehouse shift. Not much, but it's steady. Got my kid back in daycare." "That's amazing," Evan said, offering his hand. Malcolm took it, gripping tightly. "Just wanted you to know, man. What you're doing, it matters." Evan watched him walk away, then turned back to the grill, blinking fast as the smoke hit his eyes. Later, when they packed up, Harper slipped her hand into his and whispered, "See what you started?" "I just made some pancakes," he said. She smiled. "Yeah, and then you kept showing up." That night, back at home, Jonah asked if he could stay up late. "Just 10 more minutes," he pleaded, curling against Evan's side on the couch. They watched a documentary about space, Jonah asking questions faster than the narrator could explain. Evan answered what he could, promised to look up the rest. "Dad?" Jonah asked quietly. "Yeah, buddy?" "How did you know how to be a dad? Like when you were alone with me and Maisie? Weren't you scared?" Evan looked down at him. "Every day." "Then how did you do it?" Evan paused. "Because someone fed us when we couldn't feed ourselves," he said. "Because someone gave us time, and love, and room to grow." Jonah nodded, content. "I want to be like that for people someday." "You will," Evan said. "You already are." Jonah fell asleep soon after, his head on Evan's shoulder. Harper covered them both with a blanket and turned off the TV, her smile quiet and full. The next morning they ate breakfast on the porch, their ritual on Sundays. The air was soft, the sun still low, and birds chirped from the neighbor's tree. Maisie read aloud from the newspaper, pausing to skip the boring parts. Jonah kicked a ball across the yard. Evan looked around at the life they'd built, from a dented kitchen, from hand-me-down clothes, from late-night tears and early-morning fear. From one small act of kindness, the day Harper knocked on his door and handed him a paper bag and a knit purple hat. Now they had a family, not perfect, but real, strong, growing. And the hunger that once lived in his bones, hunger for food, for peace, for connection, had been replaced by something warmer. It was enough. It was everything. And it was theirs. And it was theirs. By fall, Maisie returned to college with a growing stack of textbooks and a part-time tutoring job at the campus literacy center. She called every Sunday, often while walking to class, her voice crackling over speakerphone as she shared everything from political debates in sociology to a squirrel that had stolen her sandwich. Evan never tired of hearing her talk. Every word was a reminder of what they'd come through, what she'd become. She asked questions now he never would have known how to answer at her age. Why do some kids fall through the cracks? Why don't we do more for families like ours? How do you stay kind when the world doesn't make it easy? He didn't always have answers, but he always listened. Jonah entered sixth grade with a new pair of shoes and a sudden shyness around girls that made Harper raise an eyebrow. He still clung to his bedtime rituals, still brought his drawings to Evan for approval, but he was stretching, growing, slowly becoming a boy who didn't always need to be held, but still needed to be seen. One evening, while cleaning out a storage bin in the attic, Evan found a bundle of old letters. Some were unopened bills from years ago, back when opening the mail felt like lighting a match beside a fuel tank. Others were notes from food assistance programs, school forms, application rejections, each one like a snapshot of a time when every day had felt like survival. He sat on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of those days, and let the weight of it settle, not in grief, in awe. Because they'd made it. They had gone without so many things. Yet here they were, still standing, still together, stronger, not in spite of the struggle, but because of it. He sorted through the papers until he found one from the earliest days, a receipt from the corner store, 1 loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, 4 cans of soup, total $11.62, paid with a gift card. Harper had slipped into an envelope. He remembered how his hands had shaken that night, standing in line behind a woman with a toddler and a cart full of groceries, praying the total wouldn't go over. How he had walked home in the dark, clutching the bag like it was treasure. How Maisie had danced when she saw the soup. He folded the receipt carefully and placed it in the box labeled keepsakes. It wasn't much, but it was sacred. That winter, Jonah got sick. Nothing serious, just a stubborn flu, but enough to keep him home for a week. Evan stayed up with him through the worst nights, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, spooning warm broth into his mouth, whispering lullabies he hadn't sung in years. Harper watched from the doorway more than once, her arms folded, her eyes shining with quiet love. "You're good at this," she said softly. "I had practice," he replied, brushing sweat from Jonah's brow, "and good teachers." Jonah recovered by Christmas, bounding back to health, like he hadn't spent the week barely able to speak. He helped decorate the tree, placing ornaments with the seriousness of a sculptor. Maisie came home 3 days before the holiday, dragging a duffel bag and a backpack stuffed with gifts she'd bought from the campus store, nothing expensive but chosen with care. That Christmas morning, they all sat on the living room floor in pajamas, surrounded by torn wrapping paper, candles flickering on the mantel. Jonah handed Evan a small box wrapped in blue tissue paper. Inside was a keychain, wooden, hand-painted, with a single word etched into it. Steady. Jonah cleared his throat. "I made it at school. The assignment was to choose one word that reminded us of home." Evan stared at it, fingers tightening around the edges. Harper rested her head on his shoulder. "That's what you've been to us, steady." Maisie nodded, leaning in, even when things weren't. Evan couldn't speak. He just pulled them both close, one arm around each, the keychain pressed tightly in his palm. That night, after the dishes were washed and the last of the cider had been poured, Evan stepped out onto the porch. Snow was falling again, gently this time, covering the street in a soft hush. The porch light flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the railing. He sat on the top step, letting the silence fill his lungs, remembering, honoring. Not the pain, but the climb. The door opened behind him. Harper stepped out, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "I've been thinking," she said. "Dangerous," he teased gently. She nudged his arm. "I've been thinking about starting a mentorship group for young moms, maybe even dads. People who are just starting out, scared, broke, overwhelmed. People like we were." Evan turned to her. "You think we're ready?" She smiled. "We're more than ready." He looked out over the yard where the snow was collecting softly along the walk, untouched. "Then let's do it," he said. "Let's be what we needed." They sat together like that for a long time, listening to the quiet, wrapped in one another, and the knowledge that life had become something not just worth living, but worth sharing. Harper opened the mentorship group in the spring. They hosted meetings every Thursday night in the basement of a local church, where the folding chairs wobbled and the coffee was weak. But the welcome was warm. The first week, only 3 people came. A teenage mother named Elena with her 6-month-old son, a man in his 20s who had just gotten custody of his little sister after their parents' overdose, and a woman named Carla who didn't say much at all, just sat with her arms folded and her eyes scanning the exits. Harper brought banana bread. Evan made a pot of real coffee and showed up early to set out name tags. Jonah helped carry folding chairs, and Maisie, when she was home from college, volunteered to babysit so parents could speak without distraction. By the 3rd week, 8 people came. By the 5th, 12. They didn't advertise. They didn't need to. Word got around. About the woman who listened without judgment. About the man who spoke softly about nights spent hungry and mornings spent afraid to hope. About how no one asked for proof of hardship. How they didn't treat people like projects, but like family. One night, after the group had left and the chairs had been folded and the last of the coffee dumped, Evan stood in the middle of the empty room and looked around. "It feels full even when it's not," he said. Harper smiled. "That's how you know it's sacred." Jonah joined them at the door, pulling on his jacket. "Can we stop for fries?" Harper ruffled his hair. "Always." In the car, Evan drove slowly, letting the windows fog. Jonah hummed a tune from a movie soundtrack. Harper watched the streetlights slide across the windshield, and Evan thought again, for maybe the 1000th time, about that morning, years ago, when a knock at the door changed the course of everything. That fall, the local newspaper ran a story about the mentorship group. Someone had nominated Harper for a local leadership award. The journalist had come to observe one of the meetings and then insisted on staying for 3. She wrote about their journey, their beginnings, and how their living room had once been the only place they felt safe. She called it the family that grew from hunger. Evan didn't like the attention. He didn't want applause. But when Jonah read the article aloud at dinner and paused at the quote where Evan was described as the steady heartbeat behind every second chance, he didn't say a word, just reached over and squeezed Harper's hand under the table. Maisie called that night from school. The article had been posted online, and one of her professors had forwarded it to the class. She laughed. "Dad, you're officially viral." Evan groaned. "I don't even know what that means." "It means people see you now," she said. "They see what I've always seen." He looked out the window, heart full. "I'm glad they see us, all of us." Years passed, as they always do. The mentorship group outgrew the church basement and moved to a donated storefront. Harper trained new volunteers. Evan kept showing up with coffee and a gentle word for anyone who looked like they were about to turn around and leave. Jonah became a teenager with 2 big sneakers and a mind that never stopped asking questions. He joined the student council, started a community garden at his middle school, and wrote essays about equity and empathy that made his teachers do double takes. One afternoon, Evan picked him up from school and found him deep in conversation with a boy who was clearly upset. They stood near the fence, backpacks slung low, heads close together. Evan waited, engine idling. When Jonah finally climbed into the front seat, he looked serious. "He told me his mom forgot to pick him up last week," Jonah said, "that she forgets a lot, that they don't always have dinner." Evan nodded slowly. "I gave him the card," Jonah said. "What card?" "The one from the mentorship place. I told him it wasn't just for moms." Evan stared at him for a long moment. "You did good, son." Jonah leaned back against the headrest and closed his eyes. "I just remembered what it was like. Back when it was just me and Maisie, and you didn't know how to make the lights stay on." Evan didn't flinch. He didn't shrink. He nodded. "It's part of our story," he said. "It made us who we are." "And who are we?" Jonah asked. Evan smiled. "We're the ones who keep the door open." That night Harper found the old purple hat in the closet again. The color had faded, and one of the stitches near the rim had started to unravel. She held it in her lap for a long time, her fingers brushing over the yarn. "We should frame it," Evan said from across the room, "before it falls apart." "Not yet," Harper said. "Why not?" "Because it still feels like it belongs to someone," she said. "Like someone else out there needs it next." Evan nodded. "Then we'll keep it safe. One day maybe they'd pass it on. Maybe they'd fold it into a care package for someone starting over. Maybe it would rest in another hallway, near another front door, waiting for another child to pull it over cold ears and feel somehow less alone. Because that's what kindness did. It stayed. Even after the food was gone, after the rent was paid, after the worst had passed, it remained, a thread stitched through memory and family and home. The hunger they'd known had long since faded, but they never forgot it. And because they remembered, they could feed others, not just with food, but with warmth, with presence, with love given freely and without condition. Maisie graduated with honors and a job offer at a literacy foundation. Jonah wrote a poem that was published in a national teen magazine. Harper was invited to speak at a state conference for nonprofit leaders. Evan declined a formal award from the city but accepted a wooden bench dedicated in his name, placed just outside the library where it all began. The plaque read simply, "For those who feed others even when they're starving themselves." Evan sat on that bench one evening as the sun dipped behind the library roof. Jonah sat beside him, long legs stretched out, hands deep in his hoodie pockets. "Dad?" he asked. "Yeah? Do you ever miss the old days?" Evan thought about it. "I miss the way we grew together," he said. "I don't miss the pain, but I miss the beginning, when every win felt like a miracle." Jonah nodded. "It still does," he said. And Evan knew he was right, because some miracles don't come with thunder or fire. Some just knock on the door one morning, carrying muffins and wearing a purple knit hat. And if you're lucky, if your heart's still open, you let them in. You feed your daughter, and somehow someone feeds you. And in the quiet that follows, everything begins again.